Welcome. This introductory unit looks at the intellectual environments, the problems, and the kind of questions that form the deep background for our thinking. Often this deep background and the beliefs that spring from it come from our parents, friends, teachers, and associates. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you have accepted your beliefs from these sources and not done your own thinking about them, then they're not really your beliefs and you are not truly thinking your own thoughts. That's a distinct and frightening possibility. Yet, how do we begin to think our own thoughts? Let's start by considering where our thoughts come from. The common ideas that are expressed and exchanged in our social circles, particularly the more prevalent ideas, form our intellectual environment. And most of the time, our intellectual environment will roughly correspond to the social environment, that is, to the communities to which we belong, including our families, neighbors, friends, co-workers, teammates, etc. These communities can spawn very different kinds of intellectual environments, depending on the ideas that gain prominence in them. Eventually, the ideas that we gather from our intellectual environment come together to form in our mind a model of what the world is and how it behaves. This model helps us understand things and make decisions. Philosophers sometimes call this model a worldview, the framework of ideas and beliefs that form the lens through which we interpret and interact with the world. Our worldview and the intellectual environment in which we live, taken together, form the deep background for our thinking and are the source of most of our ideas about nearly everything. There are many different worldviews. Some are faulty because they've been proven wrong through scientific discovery, such as the Ptolemaic model of the solar system. Others are faulty because their political and moral consequences have turned out to be very destructive, such as Soviet communism. So, what makes an acceptable worldview? An acceptable worldview should be rational, that is, it should correspond appropriately and usefully to the world as people actually experience it. It should be ethical, that is, it should tell us something about the difference between right and wrong, and it should be optimistic. That is, it should presuppose that life on Earth is intrinsically valuable and worth preserving. That's the way the famous Nobel laureate, Dr. Albert Schweitzer, described it. One of the ways that our intellectual environment and worldview express themselves is in the use of framing language. These are the words, phrases, and grammar that we use to think and speak of things in a certain way. Here's an example of the use of framing language to describe an important event in British history, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, and one of its participants, Guy Fawkes. In the year 1605, Guy Fawkes attempted to start a people's revolution against corruption, inherited privilege, and social injustice in the British government. Now, look at the language that frames this statement. In the year 1605, Guy Fawkes planned a terrorist attack against a group of Protestant politicians in an attempt to install a Catholic theocracy in Britain. Both of these statements, taken as statements, are true, but they're both framed very differently. In the first statement, Fawkes is portrayed as a courageous political activist. In the second, he's framed as a dangerous religious fanatic. And because of the different frames, they lead the reader to understand and interpret the man's life and purposes very differently. This, in turn, leads the reader to draw different conclusions. And that's the power of framing language. Now, it's probably not possible to speak about anything without framing it one way or another. When people frame things differently, conflict can result, just as if they were starting from different premises or presupposing different worldviews. So it's important to listen carefully to framing language to see how it might skew your ability to think critically about an issue. Usually, logic and critical thinking skills are invoked in response to a need. And often, this need takes the form of a problem that can't be solved until we gather some kind of information. Critical thinking about problems usually requires a process, the first stage of which is observation, looking for reliable information, and taking careful notes about specifics. This also requires that we be as objective as possible by removing any biases such as favoritism or personal dislike. Separating your observations from your personal preferences and opinions can often be difficult. But the more serious the problem, the more important it can be to observe something non-judgmentally before coming to a decision. So we've talked about intellectual environments, worldviews, and problems. Now it's time to consider the role of questioning in critical thinking. In particular, we want to know what makes a good question. So let me propose a set of characteristics that describe good questions. Good questions are direct. They address the actual problems and not tangential or unrelated issues. They are useful. The process of answering a good question actually helps you solve your problem. And they are open and creative. There might be more than one possible correct answer, and some of the better answers to good questions prompt more good questions. There are also several distinct kinds of bad questions, specifically rhetorical questions, where the questioner already knows the answer and is trying to prompt that same answer from his or her listeners. Rhetorical questions are often disguised beliefs, masquerading as questions, and can be used as tools of verbal aggression. Then we have leading questions, which manipulate someone into believing something they might not believe. Usually, leading questions come in a series that predispose us to respond in a particular way to the last question in the series. Push polling, in which leading questions are often used in political campaigning, is a good example of a leading questions. We also have loaded or complex questions, which are questions whose form compels the answerer to accept a problematic supposition contained within the question. And like rhetorical questions, loaded questions can also be used aggressively to control a debate and to subordinate others. We have obstructionist questions, which are questions that someone asks to interrupt someone else's train of thought. Obstructionist questions are designed to sidetrack a discussion. Typically, obstructionist questions ask about definitions or push the discussion into abstractions, and so they often involve hair-splitting and nitpicking. We have framing questions, which use specific words, terms, and phrases to limit the way a certain topic can be discussed. They're like loaded questions in that they presuppose a certain way of thinking or talking about the topic. And finally, we've got empty questions, which have no answer and whose answers lead to dead ends. An empty question cannot tell you anything that you don't already know. There are both habits of good thinking and habits of bad thinking. The bad habits tend to arise in two ways. They arise because of how we think. These are bad habits that are mostly psychological factors such as fears, motivations, and attitudes. And bad habits also arise because of what we think. And these habits arise when our thinking becomes problematic, particularly concerning our beliefs. Allow me to quickly inventory some of the most egregious habits of bad thought. First, self-interest. That is, advancing some argument or defending some worldview only because you personally stand to benefit if it's true and for no other reason. Second, saving face. That is, covering up one's own mistakes, harmful actions, or foolish choices. Third, peer pressure. That is, accepting an idea or worldview only because it's favored by the group that one belongs to and for really no other reason. Fourth, stereotyping and prejudice. That is, treating people as tokens of a type, almost never as individuals with their own distinct qualities. Fifth, excessive skepticism. That is, unreasonable demanding that one's assertions and claims be provable beyond all possible doubt. Sixth, intellectual laziness and willful ignorance. That is, giving up too soon or sidestepping the important questions that really matter in a human life, such as those concerning truth, freedom, and our own mortality. And seventh, relativism. That is, believing that a claim is true or false only relative to some other condition. There are many varieties of relativism, but the two most common are subjective relativism and cultural relativism. Subjective relativism is the claim that all truth is in the eye of the beholder, or that something is true if someone believes it to be true, and then it is true for that person, or perhaps only for that person. Cultural relativism is the idea that something is true or right because it's generally accepted by some culture or society. The problem with accepting these kinds of relativism is that they make truth or falsity relative to personal or cultural beliefs. And while it's respectful to consider others' points of view, differences in perspective do not entail that philosophical questions are entirely subjective. Being open to other personal and cultural beliefs and attitudes does not mean that we have to accept them without good reason. Now, let's close by looking at a few dictates of good thinking. Be curious. Curiosity leads to discovery, invention, expanded awareness of the world and of the self. Be self-aware. Know your own habits, faults, desires, powers, and talents. Be healthy. Good health as a thinking habit involves getting enough exercise, eating nutritious food, practicing sound hygiene, and getting enough sleep. Be courageous. To be a courageous thinker means to care more for the truth than for one's personal interests. It means committing yourself to what you rationally judge to be the best course of action, whether or not your friends or the authorities accept it. Be reasonably skeptical. Healthy skepticism is an unwillingness to take things for granted or to accept the popular explanations for things. It prefers to investigate many possibilities before settling on the best available explanation. Think for yourself. Don't let other people do your thinking for you. Don't blindly accept claims without clearly, consistently, and rationally thinking them through. Keep it simple. If you've got two or more competing explanations, other things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the best, since it often relies on the fewest assumptions. Be precise. For the purpose of reasoning as clearly and as systematically as possible, it's important to use our words very carefully, and the best way to do this is to craft good definitions. Be patient. Good critical thinking often needs to uncover that which is subtle, hard to discern at first, and easy to overlook. And the search for these subtleties should not be hasty. Be consistent. It's important that one's answers to the big questions generally cohere well together and do not obviously contradict each other. Consistency also means staying on topic, sticking to the facts, and following an argument to its conclusion. Be open-minded. Being open-minded means listening to others, taking their views seriously, and treating their ideas with respect even while critically examining them. And finally, ask for help. While it's important to make your own decisions about your own life, there's nothing wrong with asking others whom you trust to offer you advice and guidance. The shared wisdom and experience of one's friends, elders, and associates can often lead to different perspectives and better decisions. That's it for now. As you work through this unit, try to focus on your intellectual environment, your worldview, and the way you handle the problems and issues that matter most to you. Gaining clarity about these matters is a prerequisite for genuinely thinking your own thoughts. And that's the first step toward becoming a critical thinker. I hope you enjoy your journey through this course. And on behalf of my philosophy colleagues, best wishes.